Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Sam Brookhouse, and this is the Class Play Podcast. We're rolling into the last week of covering the top quarterbacks. Today, QB1 out of USC, Caleb Williams. The podcast is a companion piece to our tour of the top four, live now on SumerSports.com. We have Caleb Williams up. Joining me today, I have Tej Seth and Ben Brown. Tej, how you doing today?
I'm doing great. I read your Caleb Williams article yesterday. For a data scientist, I think it's so impressive how good you are at writing, at really putting the journey of these quarterbacks into perspective. So I'm excited to kind of tie a bow on that today and talk about Williams, our QB1 on the show today.
Appreciate it, man. And Ben, also another great writer, has a piece up on SumerSports.com. Ben, tell us about your new piece.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks for having me, Sam. Tej, it's always a pleasure. Yeah, I did a little bit. Obviously, I think everyone at this point in time knows Dane Brugler. Great film analytics. Obviously, dives really deeply into every single prospect. Puts out, I would say, very much maybe outside of Sumer Scouts Draft Guide, probably has the best draft guide in the business, digging into people. And there's some ways in which you can apply some modeling techniques from a natural language processing standpoint to kind of draw out some key characteristics and things from some of that written text that Dane does. So I did an article kind of highlighting that, some top 8 takeaways for all the guys. So you can definitely check that out. And I'm planning on doing one for, wide receivers and maybe a couple of other positions before the draft really kicks off here next week in Detroit.
Awesome. And if you like all the hard work that Ben and Tej and our colleague Eric Eager and Sean Syed have done, Thomas Dimitrov, get excited for our draft show coming up on Thursday this week. We're going to have Thomas and Eric in Atlanta live covering every pick. And the four of us, Sean, Tej, Ben, and I, will be in Detroit live feeding into that show. We're going to have other shows, late night shows. If you want to read, watch, and listen, Sumer Sports is the place for you this week. And if you haven't gotten a copy of our rookie guide, definitely do that before the draft so you can be well informed. Guys, Caleb Williams, QB1. He's been that way for a very long time, most of the year. Describe Caleb Williams in a word, Tej.
So I had a lot of words I was thinking about, but the one I ended up deciding on was stimulating. I think whenever Caleb Williams steps on the field, there is something dynamic that is about to happen with his play style. You kind of just get that from him. And I think that was always really fun to watch his games at USC, where you knew that there was going to be excitement involved and you were going to be entertained and wowed by a lot of the stuff that he was doing in both directions oftentimes. And I also think that off the field, he's been someone that has really stretched what we think about a modern NFL quarterback. He's definitely someone who leans into their personality a lot more, which I think is a really good thing, despite a lot of people online telling you that it's not. I think that he is someone that will kind of change the way that we look at quarterbacks and how they can transfer with their coaches to get to different spots in college. And then also some of the things that you can demand if you're a quarterback during the draft process and how you can be treated once you actually get to the NFL. All of that together, I think is going to be really interesting to follow with him and then to see what happens after that for the quarterbacks that follow him that are his level.
Great analysis, Tej. Ben, what about you?
Yeah, I went with creative. I do think in a lot of ways, maybe a better definition is one that is utilized by for people used on Patrick Mahomes, almost like a magician, a creative magician in a lot of ways. You walk away from Caleb Williams' tape, and I think Tej described this really well as well, but you walk away in almost a mystifying way. How did he do that? Both on probably from a good perspective and then occasionally some bad type plays as well, the highly negative plays. But to me, there is an escapability aspect or a creative aspect that doesn't exist in most other people that, play the quarterback position or just go, try to do things in the similar fashion to other people. He's just going to play football in a different way, and you have to kind of live with both the good and the bad. But at the end of the day, he's going to give you a better chance at winning that football game than, essentially basically every other human being alive in a lot of circles, right? So I think that the creative, almost magician type aspect is very much how I describe, kind of like what Tej said, both on and off the field in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I like how you said that he plays that different game. And that's why my word for him was next gen. we've come into this time where Patrick Mahomes is really the archetype for what the best quarterback looks like. We've moved past the Tom Brady, the Drew Brees, the Peyton Manning, pocket passer, assassin type archetype. And so when you look at Patrick Mahomes, you look at Jordan Love, you look at these kind of guys that have started dominating the NFL, obviously the next crop of guys are going to be trying to imitate them. I think Caleb Williams is the first in this kind of next generation that was inspired by the Mahomeses of the world and such. One of the ways I kind of described it is obviously we had the Steph Curry come in and revolutionize basketball with the 3-point shot. And kind of the first guy who was compared to Steph Curry was Trae Young. I actually think that's a great comp for Caleb, given what we've seen and how he kind of conducts himself and the confidence that he has. I like that Trae Young comparison. And so we're looking at a next-gen prospect, and I'd expect to see more prospects in the next few years that are like him. And so we brought up that one word, Tej. What are some of the pros and cons that informed that decision?
Yeah, I really like the way that you described Caleb Williams there, guys. So like, just expanding on that a little bit, I think when you look at his pros, passing on the move is his biggest strength. I think that when he is either trying to avoid pressure and get out of the pocket, or maybe even some of the design stuff that Lincoln Riley and Cliff Kingsbury had him do last year, where he's doing some rolling out of the pocket himself, his way to be able to not throw always with his hips facing the target, I think is something that's going to be really helpful for him as he translates to the NFL. That kind of goes hand in hand with some of his scramble ability. I think going back to what we talked about with Jaden Daniels last week, when you are able to scramble and you are even able to be used on designed runs, it gives you a lot longer of a time in the NFL to figure out some of the other stuff, to figure out some of the passing or the sack avoidance. And I think he has enough of that where it'll be able to give him a longer leash when it comes to figuring out how to play quarterback at a high level in the NFL. And going off of that, he has a lot of NFL throws. You see middle of the field passing when you watch him. You really see him attacking that intermediate middle area of the field, which is kind of the money zone for NFL quarterbacks. He has a lot of plays where he's moving in the pocket and still making the throws, and he has just a large sample size. We've seen him as a starting quarterback from mid-season 2021 at Oklahoma, and then 2 seasons at USC, one where he won a Heisman. So you've really been able to see a lot of his ability throughout his college career, and that makes me feel a little bit more comfortable about him compared to some other quarterbacks in this class going to the next level. But there are some cons that come along with that. I think he holds onto the ball for too long at times. He had the highest time to throw of the top 8 quarterbacks in this class. That could be a positive or negative. I think some research done by Zach Drapkin, who's at the Eagles now, has showed that you want to have a longer time to throw when you're not pressured and a shorter time to throw when you're pressured. And so as long as he kind of finds that balance, he should be fine. But he seems to have a pretty long time to throw overall. And then his height and weight, I think, are something that might be concerning at the next level. Weight matters a little bit more than height does for quarterbacks when looking at their correlation coefficients from what they tested at the combine to NFL production. So his weight should be fine, and I think he can do things to overcome his height, like his movement ability, like we talked about.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, Tej. Ben, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it, what Tej already says, obviously, very much fits with what I'm kind of seeing as well, kind of going back to it in the discussion of like one adjective for him. Like, it is the improv skills, right? It's the ability to kind of handle this like chaotic game in a manner in which a lot of other people can't handle it, and kind of almost like make sense and work around like the messiness and create something that few others could actually create. So I think there's like an ability there that is really hard to quantify, really hard to in some ways understand, but like an ability to buy time under pressure. I think in the ways in which he experiences pressure as well, like a lot of guys drop their eyes and start to run almost immediately. And I think from Caleb Williams' perspective, like a lot of his hugely explosive type passing plays came from a pressure type pocket. And I think his ability to kind of keep his eyes downfield has allowed him to make so many of these like game breaking type plays with the pocket collapsing around him or moving outside of the pocket. So I really like those sorts of abilities. I think very much kind of what, Tej mentioned, like he can make all of the NFL type throws. I think there is some cons with respect to like him playing within rhythm, and specifically like how playing within rhythm kind of benefits like the Bears offense in particular. Some of those like on schedule type throws. I think there's at least a question of why is he not throwing this ball and trying to create more plays later on when the time to throw kind of increases dramatically. So I think in some ways that could definitely be viewed as a con. I think the improv plays in general can lead to like massively negative EPA swings. I think we did see that with some of his turnover type plays. He does seem to be in a way or word like careless with the football. Ton of fumble type situations on some of those improv plays as well. So you obviously take the good with the bad, but the bad can very much be in a lot of ways devastating, and it can a lot of ways lead to games like what they faced against Notre Dame this season when they were 6-0 and kind of still thought of as one of this top 25 type teams. The interceptions early kind of buried them, and they really didn't have a say throughout that entire matchup. So I think there is some carelessness with the football that is definitely a con. And then, kind of going to the, extended topic, like quality of opposing defenses faced. I think when you go back and look at, even throughout his career where he was at facing off against some of these top 25 teams, like there's not a lot of the electric type plays that we've seen on film happening against some of these more quality defenses. And I do think, the Notre Dames of the world at least seem to have him figured out from a scripted play standpoint. And I think that's got to be at least somewhat of a concern in the overall evaluation for Caleb Williams at this time.
Yes, I think y'all both summarized it very well. And I'll just go a bit deeper on that improvisational point. As compared to the draft class, Caleb Williams is the one player who has a generational trait. And that trait is his improv. And his improv generally leads to downfield throws, which I think is where those comparables to Aaron Rodgers and Patrick Mahomes really come true. Because at that NFL level, you don't want to be taking hits from safeties and linebackers down the field. You want to be pushing that ball down the field to your receivers who hopefully are wide open downfield if you can kind of give them a little space and give them a little time. And I think that's the one generational prospect that Caleb Williams has. And I think he's one of the few players that has a generational trait in this draft. Cons, obviously, ball security, I think, is his major one. You can't be fumbling in the NFL. That's just, you can't give the ball over. Teams are too good. Games are too tight. I think that may cause some problems for him. So, Ben, you brought up that Notre Dame game. As we move into the next segment where we talk about the most intriguing game, talk about what you saw in that Notre Dame game and maybe some other games.
Yeah, definitely. And it definitely wasn't like his most intriguing game, but I think in a lot of ways, this was kind of the peak spot for USC in this 2023 season, right? Like I said, 6-0. And honestly, like it did not start out, I would say, well whatsoever. I think there was a bad pick right away that Caleb Williams threw. Maybe could have been a pick six. I think they brought it down to like the 15-yard line and scored, in the next play. And then you're immediately down right away, right? They don't really respond, I would say, off of that, getting the ball back. I think both teams went like a punt putt sort of situation. And then I do think it was probably like Williams and maybe USC's like most productive drive in the first quarter. He had a scramble on like 1st and 10 that is like very much, I would say, the synopsis of what he can bring to an NFL offense against a really strong defense that just not a lot of other players can do. It reminded me in a lot of ways of like Lamar Jackson, but they ended up kind of stalling out on that drive as well. I think it was 7-3. Notre Dame kicks a field goal 10-3. USC gets the ball back with 4 minutes to go in the first half, and you're like, okay, if they score here, like this is a ball game. And then you get like the second interception, and that should have been a pick six as well. I think that one was brought down to like the 3 or 2 yard line. And the game doesn't completely necessarily feel over, but at that point, like you're just not confident in USC's defense whatsoever getting enough stops. But I still think, that interception, I think get another one before the half as well. Like there was 3 really poor plays, and yet USC kind of came back and they did respond. And although they couldn't get like the defensive stops in the third quarter, I think they allowed a kickoff return for a touchdown as well. But they did cut the lead to 11 in a game that felt like it could very much slip away. And it did actually end up slipping away at the end. But I thought there was enough flash plays in that late second, early third quarter, and in that first drive in the first quarter where you can see, Caleb Williams, if he can avoid some of these negative plays early on in this idea that he has to play so frenetically or so chaotic from behind, like they could have won this football game, and they were very legitimate, I would say somewhat contenders at least to be a top 10 team if things went, a couple different ways. But that's like the upside case that Caleb Williams can provide to any sort of team, is like with him, you obviously very much have to take the good with the bad, but that upside case is, for the most part, simply unmatched from a, quarterback prospect that we've seen, since, in quite some time in a lot of ways, right? Like he very much is getting the Patrick Mahomes comp for a reason. And I think you do see kind of that flash of Patrick Mahomes, Lamar Jackson, and the ability to navigate pressure against a strong defense in this matchup against Notre Dame, even though the score doesn't necessarily dictate or speak to that.
Yeah, as a Notre Dame graduate, I was definitely glad to grab that win as opposed to the year prior where he absolutely eviscerated us. Yep. And so, Tej, when I was going through the film this week, as I was writing that article, there was one game that absolutely made me drop everything, text you, text Ben, text some of our other colleagues, and be like, this is one of the most incredible games I've ever watched, and that's the Red River Shootout 2021. Tell us more about it.
Yeah, I mean, Red River every year is just complete craziness. And I think this one might have been peak Red River, Oklahoma, Texas, Texas State Fair, like so much going on in this game. And I think when you started this game, you first have Xavier Worthy just taking the first play from scrimmage for a touchdown. And then you have Spencer Rattler have like a pretty down game for him where he throws a couple interceptions early. Oklahoma goes down 28-7. And then you start having the announcers talk about like, 5-star recruit Caleb Williams is warming up on the sidelines. And you're like, that's interesting. And comes in, has one of the best runs you'll ever see probably from a quarterback in college football, breaking off a touchdown, really giving Oklahoma life in this game. And then it kind of like goes back and forth between him and Rattler. And eventually Caleb Williams comes in, throws one of the better touchdown passes you'll see from a college football quarterback to Marvin Mims, where he threw it to the perfect front right corner of the end zone, right where Mims could catch it. Another touchdown there. And he finishes with a 97.5 QBR in this game, brought Oklahoma back from down 28-7 to winning, where they ended up scoring 55 points in this game. I think it was just like a perfect encapsulation of peak Caleb Williams, like really what he could do at that level. And then like another game in like a very similar situation, like national profile, like a lot of eyeballs on this game I thought of was the Pac-12 championship against Utah in 2022, where we know Utah was like his Achilles heel in college, ended up finishing 0-3 against them. But in this game in particular, he went 28 for 41, 363 yards and 3 touchdowns. He played through an injury. They had the classic bad USC defense that he had to overcome. But the one downside of this game was he took 7 sacks. And so even though he had 5 rushes on his own, 7 sacks for a total of 12, he only finished with 21 rushing yards because in college, the sack yardage loss counts against you. And so I think that was a little bit of an issue in this game for him, just because we saw some of that pressure to sack rate that's not super well by him, is like that kind of showed up in this game. But like all the other stuff was there, and his grit and his fight to play through an injury was there. But there was like that trade-off that he made in this game as well.
Yeah, and I think rolling straight from that Utah conference championship game into the bowl game makes a lot of sense for me. Obviously, I'm a Tulane fan, probably in the top 1%, if not 0.0005% of Tulane football fans. I was in the building for the bowl game against Tulane, the 2020, I guess it would have been 2023 Cotton Bowl, technically, in Dallas. And I'm just going to like step away from the stats. I did the same thing in my article. It was terrifying. We walked in and we really had a pretty good defense. Dorian Williams, who's now with the Bills, Nick Anderson, who made a camp with the Saints, Jarius Monroe, who's probably going to be drafted, if not making a camp for sure this year. There was NFL caliber defenders on a defense that was one of the better ones in the league and had shut down a Kansas State team earlier in the year that had an NFL running back in Deuce Vaughn. So this wasn't, your classic G5 team. This was a very, very talented team. And Caleb just ripped them apart single-handedly while missing Jordan Addison on the outside. It was one of the most incredible performances I've ever seen period. And I've watched a lot of football in my lifetime, and I played a lot of football in my lifetime. And I highlight that generational aspect of his improvisation, because what shocked me is he had a lot of opportunities to run. And it was almost as if the Tulane defense was saying, you can scramble around, get 4 or 5 yards on the run, but we don't really want you to kill us in the passing game. And so the contain wasn't great, but what was happening when he broke the pocket and, Dorian Williams, an NFL linebacker, was bearing down on him, was he was able to stretch it until he's about to get hit and just throw a dart down the field over and over and over and over again to the tune of 500 plus yards and 40 plus points. It was terrifying. I'm glad Tulane got the win. I'm going to be frank, it was not enjoyable to rewatch it for the first time 2 years later this week. But obviously the end of the game when Tulane raises that Cotton Bowl trophy, generational moment for Tulane. Gotta love it. Moving forward off of my emotional hijinks, let's move it forward to some player comparables. Tej, tell us a great player comparable from the draft guide and some other things that you think.
Yeah, so I did cheat a little bit here and just took his closest comp from the draft guide, but I do think it makes a little bit of intuitive sense once I explain it. So I have Caleb Williams' closest comp as Trevor Lawrence. And so when I look at these two prospects, if Lawrence is in your S tier of quarterback prospects since, let's say, 2000, then I think Williams is in the A tier. He's right below that. They are quarterbacks who were both decided they were going to be the number one pick the year before they actually came out of college. There was all the tank for Trevor, tank for Caleb. Like, both of those had that type of motion among fans of NFL teams. And I think like the best asset that both of them have is their ability to throw on the move. Going back to what we talked about earlier, like I think again, like when you look at some other quarterbacks that might not have the combination of arm strength and accuracy that these two have, they really have to set their feet, have their left hip pointing towards the target, and to make that throw with a good base. I think that these quarterbacks might almost be better when throwing on the move because they have that torque in their body that allows them to be able to make those throws. So I think that's a very strong similarity to them. And I think that there's a decent point about, like how Lawrence probably had a little bit of a higher floor, but Williams is a higher ceiling. But I still see their range of outcomes as pretty similar, where I could see a situation where Caleb Williams doesn't work out in the NFL. It would surprise me. And obviously you could see that for Trevor Lawrence again to a lesser degree, but it's very hard to see situations where they don't work out. It's very easy to see a lot of situations where they become top 5, top 8 quarterbacks in the league, quarterbacks that are perennially in the wild card round. And I'm hoping that both of them can continue to be in that spot.
Yeah, great point. And I like how you pointed out that both of those players were on the radar after their freshman year, and similar stance where there were quarterbacks that were pretty set. There wasn't much of a quarterback controversy upon them coming in. They played pretty well. Rattler played pretty well, and Kelly Bryant played pretty well. And sure enough, the talent was just too great. Lawrence and Williams come in and take the job and really succeed. Ben, who was your comp?
Yeah, so I this was one that actually popped up from like the text analytics as well. I thought it fit really well. It was Caleb Williams' second comp running that analysis, so I went with it. But it's Kyler Murray, and obviously like no comp is perfect. We don't have to have necessarily that discussion. There are obviously some misses, but I think, kind of like Tej said, both first overall draft selections, Kyler Murray didn't have the same mystique as a guy like Trevor Lawrence or Caleb Williams. And I do think in a lot of ways, like Caleb Williams has a much higher ceiling outcome based on kind of the improv skills that you mentioned, Sam. And I think like overall he'd just be like a better overall NFL starter, even if he doesn't reach like some of those upside type cases. I think there are quite a few overlapping characteristics, both from an upside standpoint, like really strong arms, ability to handle pressure in a lot of situations, can both run and throw. I think Kyler relies, a little bit too much probably on his legs, where Williams has been really successful throwing the football downfield in those types of situations. But I think it fits. And I think, the question of some of these on schedule type throws and things are questions we're still asking about, with Kyler Murray and the offense that he can run at the NFL level. And I think like that's probably the most apt comparison that I can think of, although I still think there is some sort of like quasi middle ground between Kyler Murray, and where Caleb Williams is going to land, and maybe where like Lamar Jackson, Patrick Mahomes, and those sorts of players fit in kind of on that overall spectrum.
Yeah, I'm glad you bring up Kyler Murray because that was one of my comps. And Sean in the comments brought up that he thinks Caleb Williams' floor is undersold and that his floor is really a starting caliber player. That was kind of my approach kind of too in terms of the average outcome for Caleb Williams. It's like, are you comfortable with having a Kyler Murray on your team? I know that there was some here or there when Arizona was projected to go in the higher picks of whether you draft Caleb Williams and keep Kyler Murray or trade Kyler Murray and keep Caleb Williams, given that Kyler has been pretty productive, though he hasn't won a ton of games. I think that's a great floor for him, or at least if not a floor, a great average is that type of player. That's why my comp was kind of like what people thought Johnny Manziel might be at the time, kind of the best parts of Johnny Manziel mixed with the best parts of Baker Mayfield. Obviously, those are both Cliff Kingsbury guys. Obviously, Caleb Williams is also a Cliff Kingsbury guy. Baker coming from Texas Tech, Johnny Manziel at A&M. Obviously, when Cliff was at USC, now with the Commanders, all kind of in that tutelage, in that air raid spread offense. But I think when you kind of blend the improvisation that people loved about Johnny Manziel with the kind of precision that people loved about Baker Mayfield's game, plus the size altogether, I think kind of the best parts and the things that made both of those players first-round picks at the time, despite kind of glaring downsides for both of those players, I think you push those together, kind of cancels out some of those downsides, and it gives you a Caleb Williams type player who's most likely going to be picked first. With that in mind, we talked a little bit about Cliff Kingsbury. Obviously, he's with the Commanders now. Talking about best fit, Tage, who do you think the best team is for Caleb Williams?
Yeah, so I'll save the Bears for you guys because I think your guys' notes on the Bears are really good. So I'll give two that obviously won't happen. Like, I think we know what the Bears are doing at number one overall, but like, I think it would be cool to see him in these situations. The Vikings, just because of repairing or getting back together with Jordan Addison, that would be really cool to see. And then just like what Kevin O'Connell can do with a quarterback who can create a little bit more, I think would be really exciting, because I thought Kevin O'Connell designed a pretty good offense with Kirk Cousins, who's, generally pretty unmobile. And then even like some of the other quarterbacks that they had with Nick Mullins and different stuff like that. But then like the Josh Dobbs games, like those were really cool to watch kind of what he did with a very dynamic quarterback. So it'd be interesting to see what KOC would do with Williams. Another one, Sam, is the Saints, because I can just picture Caleb Williams like wearing that Saints uniform, the white uniforms, and like hitting Chris Olave on the sideline, hitting Rashid Shaheed deep. Like he would be his version of what Zachariah Branch was to USC last year. Like it would be really interesting to watch Caleb Williams play in New Orleans. Obviously, won't happen, but those are just some that came to mind at the top of the draft.
I'd absolutely love that, Tage. And if that suggestion could become ironclad, I'd do it today. Ben, what about your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I'm with you, Sam. I'm with Tage. I mean, I think the Vikings are the perfect fit for Caleb Williams. I would love to see that happen, but getting the band back together, no. I mean, Tage kind of hit it. Like, obviously, he's going to Chicago. We can pipe dream all day, but like that's the reality of it. To me, I don't mind what Chicago's doing. I do think, just from kind of going back to our entire discussion, like, to me, Keenan Allen, and more so Keenan Allen, less so DJ Moore, are kind of guys that win at the top of their routes. And I think in a lot of ways, like the timing aspect of it is going to be important. And I know they have separated previously on some of these like improv type plays. And I know they're veteran guys that we would expect to get open. But before I really like see that happening within the confines of this offense, I think there is going to be a question of how all this kind of fits together. But I think if you're running it back with DJ Moore and Keenan Allen, you are at least giving Caleb Williams weapons to the point where you don't have to continue to ask the question that they were asking with Justin Fields. And I think in a lot of ways, like Keenan in particular, as he ages into the latter half of his career, could turn into a guy that's just like sneaky veteran smart and always open kind of at the end of those improv plays by himself. And I think that could make a really good wrinkle and dynamic for the Bears offense. So I'm not like all in on the fit from the wide receiver standpoint, but I think it makes sense the direction that the Bears are building towards for sure.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And something that's interesting about the Bears, which I just thought about, is obviously Ryan Poles comes from that Chiefs lineage of general management and putting that team together and really setting Patrick Mahomes up to succeed. It's interesting to see that obviously Mahomes came into an environment where Kelsey and Tyreek Hill were kind of known quantities of being better players in the league. And then you bring Mahomes in and they're absolutely supercharged. I think that obviously the Bears are a great fit because Ryan Poles has set it up to where Justin Fields came in, won 7 games for them, like not a terrible season, all things considered. And now we're bringing in Caleb Williams with people that have really proven themselves in DJ Moore and Keenan Allen. And probably average, if not slightly above average offensive line coming back from last year with a couple additions, a defense that has Montez Sweat and some other pieces. I think this is the situation is going to be great for Caleb, and I think it's going to be his to take advantage of. I also did want to just mention the Commanders has the relationship with Cliff Kingsbury, another good situation with a front office, fairly new front office that's making a lot of investments. I do think it's interesting that these two teams are kind of set up well for kind of more high risk, high reward pick. In terms of like a Jaden Daniels or a Caleb Williams. Obviously Caleb Williams is probably lower risk, but you have these mobile players who are kind of run gun players, as opposed to kind of the more traditional quarterbacks that may have a higher floor, but may not fit into these kind of high flying offenses that we have.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that. I think that will be really interesting to kind of watch how that plays out. And kind of talking about supporting cast and setup, like you were talking about, Sam. Another great question from Sean here in the chat. If you were Chicago, what would you give to get up to 3 to ensure you get your wide receiver 1? So I think this is a really good question. I think if they were trading up from 9 to 3, that would be a very hefty price tag on that pick, where you're probably giving up a 2nd round pick this year, a future first, maybe some additional picks on top of that. Like there would be a decent amount of draft capital moved to get up to 3. I don't think you have to move up though to get your wide receiver 1. I think once Marvin Harrison and Malik Neighbors go off the board, let's say that happens at either 5 and 6 or maybe 6 and 8, like something along those lines, Rome Odunze suddenly becomes the highest, most coveted player in the draft because he is the last receiver of that top tier per the consensus big board. So I think that's really where we're going to see a team want to jump ahead of other teams and really go up and get Odunze. So I could even see Chicago being one of those teams where they maybe trade up to 6 or 7 and they can give the Panthers 2025 second and maybe some other day 3 picks on top of that, and they can get Malik Neighbors or Rome Odunze at that pick and give Caleb Williams a pretty high-end receiver trio as he's stepping into the NFL.
Yeah, another interesting corollary to this question was discussed by Justin Pugh and our colleague Eric Eager, talking about a Brandon Ayuk potential trade. So if you want more information on this kind of in a different context, head over to Justin Pugh's podcast where he's talking to Eric. A little plug for our guys there. So moving into our kind of last segment on Caleb himself, final destination 3 to 4 years down the road, Tej. What does Caleb's prospects look like? What has he done? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I think because of the situation that you guys talked about with the Bears and how much nurture matters versus nature with respect to quarterbacks, I think Caleb Williams is going to do pretty well with the Bears, where he can come in. Shane Waldron is a good head coach. And like you guys brought up, like above average or at least average offensive line, 2 legit receivers to throw to that should be at a pretty high level for at least the next 1 to 2 years. And so I think that'll really help him get acclimated to the NFL, where the scheme will really fit him. He'll have time to prepare. And so I'm sure there'll be growing pains early, But I think 4 years down the line, we'll be looking at him and we'll be saying, this is someone who is a top 10 quarterback in the league, someone who is about to get a top of the market extension from Chicago. And I think Chicago will be really excited to give that to him because of what he's shown so far. There might still be minor question marks, the same way that we have minor question marks about Trevor Lawrence right now. But I think Lawrence's has been some play calling issues, some supporting cast issues. As long as Chicago makes sure to give Caleb Williams some of that stuff and rework that in the aggregate, I think we'll be looking at him as someone who ranks pretty highly in expected points added or just even general quarterback rankings.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. Ben, what about your thoughts?
It is a good question. I mean this, and I say this as a Kyler Murray believer, and I know he was my comp as well, but I think like a slightly better version of Kyler Murray hopefully avoids the injury risk. I do agree with what Tage says as far as like what Chicago's putting around him. I do think that just the current state of the NFC North, like I'm not sure, how long the Restore the Roar championship window is going to stay open. I think I would let Tage answer that question, but I think the Vikings feel like they're a little bit away. And I think there's a case to be made where the Bears have like probably won an NFC North division championship in the previous 4 seasons and kind of are at least not necessarily have Caleb locked in as a top 10 quarterback, but kind of what Tage said, like they've at least answered enough of the questions where they are giving him an extension. It might not be top 3 type money, but I think it's pretty good money and they are confident in the direction of their franchise in 4 years.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense as well in terms of those, playoff appearances, division titles. I looked at someone like a Deshaun Watson, minus some of the off the field stuff, of course, but Deshaun Watson performed quite well on that rookie deal and had a great receiver in DeAndre Hopkins for a few years. And obviously, times change and you get into a different situation and it's not the same and struggles may come up. I'm not saying this will necessarily happen, but I did kind of take an eye and look at the situation that he's in now and how that may change in a division that has the Packers and the Lions, who are pretty good, and the Vikings, who have a good supporting cast and a good leadership in the front office and as the head coach. And it's going to be tough to win games, and I wouldn't be surprised if there's something like, a playoff appearance or 2 titles and then a random 4-10 or 5 and whatever year. I realize that math doesn't add up. I'm not a great mental math guy, despite being a data scientist, but I wouldn't be surprised if there's an off year and maybe some questions arise, but at the end of the day, he's still probably a franchise level, huge contract level quarterback. So speaking of quarterbacks, of course, this kind of concludes our tour of the top 4. We may have some more content next week, still keeping that under wraps for now, but stay tuned at SumerSports.com in terms of quarterbacks. Final time of our class play picks, the big one, the most important position. We're selecting some quarterbacks, and then we're going to evaluate the quality of our team. Ben, what's your quarterback selection for your class play pick?
Yeah, so I'm throwing it back maybe a little further, but this was what I have always considered to be the best college football game I've ever watched. Vince Young at the center of it. The 2005 national championship game played in 2006 against USC. Reggie Bush was on that team, Matt Leinart, and Vince Young went toe-to-toe with all of them basically and won in what was very much, I would say, probably not even the best college football game, maybe just like the best overall football game I've ever watched. And it was great, and I need to have him on my team. I think he went for like 200 yards and 3 touchdowns rushing the football. Definitely like the peak college football player for me. Would have liked to see it work out a little bit better at the NFL level, but I think giving the reins to me, I can definitely bring out the best. So I would love to have Vince Young as my starting quarterback on my squad.
That's a great pick. And you think about Vince Young as a player who's probably before his time, because probably if he has that college career and goes into this year's draft, even with Caleb there, he probably still does go number first. Obviously, some Lindell White erasure.
The Thunder and Lightning. Yeah.
Right. The Thunder and Lightning. That was a great USC team that Mac Brown and Vince Young and that crew took down. Tage, what are your class play picks for the quarterback position?
I got chills there talking about Ben, or just hearing Ben talk about his favorite football game of all time. One of my favorite games of all time was Louisville Clemson 2016. And so that's really where I just fell in love with Lamar Jackson as a college football player, but even as a prospect. You look at Lamar in that game, 295 yards of passing, 162 yards of rushing. They ended up losing at the end 42-36 to Deshaun Watson and Clemson, but it was just amazing to watch Lamar Jackson with all the hype that he had going into that game. Some of the Heisman talk around him, and like that night really confirmed like this guy is here to stay. Felt so bad for him on draft night when they kept flashing to the green room and it was just him and his mom and he was waiting to get taken. And I'm glad the Ravens ended up taking him because it was a great situation with Greg Roman for him to go into, and it ended up working out pretty well for him. On the flip side of that, I was obsessed with Johnny Manziel throughout his whole college career. Obviously had probably the exact opposite NFL career of Lamar Jackson, but I think when you looked at Johnny Manziel and just some like the aura around him and what he was able to do in that Alabama game and pulling off that upset and winning Heisman that year, and then obviously some of the stories that would come out about him in the offseason, like as a middle schooler, it was just fascinating to me that someone could be living that life where they were performing at such a high level in football, but also being able to do all of the partying off the field as well. And I think that eventually caught up to him, obviously, and it didn't work out for him in the league. But those were two guys that I was just like obsessed with when they were coming out as prospects.
Yeah, and in that kind of Johnny Manziel lane, I went with a similar player, at least in college, and that's Pat White out of West Virginia. An electric player those 2007, 2008 seasons, playing quarterback for those West Virginia teams that were really some of the first teams that kind of had that run and gun read option, Rich Rodriguez scheme on the bigger level of college football. Won a lot of games. I remember Steve Slayton. I remember those lovely blue and yellow jerseys in Morgantown. It getting loud. I remember the fateful kind of backyard brawl against Pitt. It was a simpler time in college football when we had regional rivalries like Pitt versus West Virginia. Unfortunately, conference realignment kind of messed some of that up. And Pat White, honestly, I remembered him getting drafted, but I was surprised at how high he got drafted, especially given, it's 2009. We're still in the heat of that stuff.
Well, he was supposed to be like a tweener position guy. Like they weren't even confident where exactly they were going to play him when they drafted him, I feel like. But he was like the running back, wide receiver, quarterback hybrid. But that was still when people thought like you could have somebody play all three positions somewhat successfully in random times or something. And that has like kind of fallen by the wayside for sure. But he was supposed to be like the next tier slash or something, if I remember correctly, basically. So.
Yeah, he's listed as a wide receiver on Football Reference. Obviously, he didn't play a ton. He was pretty much a one and done season guy, but gets drafted in the second round. It'd be interesting to see what happens, what would happen to him now, given that he was such an electric player. Maybe he carves out a Taysom Hill type role. Maybe he throws a little bit more and is a better passer. I don't know if, as Sean said, he either goes number one or in the seventh round, right. No middle ground there. But he's an interesting prospect, and be interesting to see how he fared today in today's college landscape and in today's NFL landscape as well. And so that brings us to the end of the class play for today. Ben, Tej, any last words?
I think we got to take a screenshot of our teams here and put them out on Twitter and see, who ends up having the best team from a wisdom of the crowd standpoint. Ben just has to go back, I think, and fill in some of his prospects from the shows he wasn't able to get to, but I'd be very curious to see, which one of you guys ends up with the best team.
We could simulate out the results once we build it, basically. It's good data scientists.
Yeah, a little 7-on-7 football, I guess, with some of the people we picked. Exciting stuff. We're excited for the draft. There's a lot of cool stuff coming out on sumersports.com. Remember to tune in to YouTube, Twitter, anything live first round during the draft. A lot of cool stuff, a lot of hard work from Tej, some of our interns, me and Ben, other people. There's going to be a lot of great stuff coming out throughout the draft. So stay tuned and stay close. Just at Sumer Sports on Twitter, sumersports.com. and Sumer Sports on YouTube to keep up with everything and stay informed during the draft. From Ben Brown, Tay Sheth, and Sam Brookhouse, thank you very much.